Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Wilfred Riley. Joining us again as a guest is Christy Kelly, and our guest this week is Robert Kelly, Professor Emeritus at Brooklyn College, author of many books, somewhere around 10, 6 of them on racial differences and things of that nature, and this most recent book, The State of the Black Family. Robert, welcome to the show. There it is in all its glory. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, and it's always good to talk to you and Wilfred, and nice meeting you, Christy.
Nice to meet you too.
Well, hopefully it keeps going. You're always working, and every time you put out a book, I'd love to have you on. You always have interesting takes, and we have great conversations. This book is kind of timely. People talk about it a lot, but it's an interesting take. So can you talk a bit, I guess, at the beginning as to why you wrote the book about the state of the Black family?
Well, I wanted to write a book about policies to help the lower quarter or so of urban Black population, the struggling cities and the people who live in them. It's easy. I don't know, it's easy, but people are focused often on, how many Blacks are getting into this or that position, the first Black that, and so on. And that's not unimportant, what's going on at the upper tier. But I'm really concerned about this lower tier and the kinds of policies that can move them forward. I didn't want that title, but my editor insisted because, I certainly have some chapters on the Black family, but this is more about education, about housing issues, about crime, and certainly the Black family is part of it. But it's so contentious. But actually now, with the book that just came out, Melissa Kearney's, the two-parent privilege. This whole issue of family has moved to the forefront. And as I think you know, I just had an article on Substack, on Glenn Lowry's Substack, where I talk about this issue of the Black family. And in particular, while I certainly think marriage should be promoted, and there are some ways to do that, the real issue is not at this point getting more people married, because even if these policies are effective, it's still going to be a decade from now, if we were sitting down, it still would be the majority of Black children would be born to unwed mothers. So it might be 55, 60% instead of 70, 75%, but it's still going to be a majority. And the issue is, what do you do for those families? What do you do for those children so that they don't fall behind? And that's what I had in this short piece on Substack. And it's what's in my book is, what do you do to pull up those kids and those families that are single-headed?
Christy, what would you like to
Did you
ask?
see the wheels turning?
No, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, no, this issue is definitely near and dear to my heart. So I talk a lot about the nuclear family and about, fatherlessness. And I've practiced father's rights and done mediation for about 15 years. So I don't think it has to be, I appreciated your book. I appreciated the videos that I've seen of you. I don't think it needs to be a binary choice. I think we need to do both at the same time. we need to make it so that it's popular and that it's cool and that marriage is something that the younger generations are now buying into
Definitely.
again. I
Definitely.
also think too that a lot of people get offended when you say the majority or when you say the numbers, because they want to quibble about the numbers of Black fatherlessness. Because the fact is that a lot of fathers are in the home, are active, but they're not married. And as long as they're not married, the mother is still a single mother. So I think the numbers are somewhat inflated. But regardless, it's still a big problem.
Big
But
number.
I
Yeah.
also agree that, we should also as well focus on, the programs that you talk about. So I'm wanting you to get into those more because I thought that those were brilliant.
Yeah, and it's interesting that she mentions programs. You talk about two good things about the book. You talk about the problems, which a lot of us do, but then you also offer some solutions. That it doesn't matter whether we agree with them or not, but many people don't offer any. So the fact that you say there are things that we can do, and what's really interesting about it is that it's coming from a place as a liberal saying, I believe that the government has a place for things. So, you gently take the conservatives to task about you need to do a little bit more than they may be willing to do. But you just openly call out the blind liberal policies to say, let's just throw money and compassion at a problem and hope it fixes it. And you're open about how those things simply don't work. And so when you talk about that, talk about the importance to you of the government getting that mix right.
Well, you have to have you have to build up personal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
One of the one of the things that liberals are unwilling to do is to put any kind of personal responsibility onto the benefits that are attached. That's what killed having the child care extension. Conservatives said, look, you have to not undermine work incentives by it. Sorry, you can't do that. Housing first. There's a whole quagmire now where people say, well, maybe people should be in sobriety programs, drug rehab programs, if they want to get housing. Liberals say, no, no, housing first. You put them in housing. And, that's undermines what people need, because one of the things about money is it may allow you to inch over the poverty line. So the poverty line is 25,000 for a family of three, or 23,000. And it's true, you give a little bit more child this and more that. You could push those people over to 27,000. Uh, but if you really want to solve problems in this country, you have to develop policies that allow people to distance themselves from poverty. Get up to 40, 50,000 for sure. And the only way you do that is work. And so there has to be I have a good deal about what has to be done to improve the education of 10-year-olds, because that's a devastating problem now. You look at the math or reading skills of Black urban kids, it's just, less than half of them. In many cities, maybe a quarter of them are just at grade level. So that's an issue that I felt. But this thing about jobs is, for many of these young people, when they get to high school, unfortunately, they don't have very strong skills. So people could say, well, we'll get them in apprenticeship programs. Uh, they don't have the skills for most of those apprenticeship programs. They need short-term certificate programs to put them on a path. And they're stackable, these certificate programs. But, you say this to liberals saying, no, they got to have middle-class livings. You put them in these certificate programs, they're going to be, poor, dead end forever. And that's not the case. But, so I think the two biggest things that I think distinguish my book from others is not even broadly that it's policy oriented, as you pointed out, a lot aren't, but that it focuses on these entry level certificate programs and how these can build people into the middle class.
Mhm.
And it focuses on what kind of programs can build up parenting so that they can help their kids begin to succeed in school at lower levels. So whether it's visiting nursing programs or tutoring programs, uh, or how the uh, charter schools have strategies to keep parent involvement. And actually, public schools are being forced to do it because of the rampant absentee problem they're facing, where, you just have high absenteeism in a lot of these schools, and you have to engage the parents in strategies to get the kids just to come to school. And hopefully you'll engage the parents in helping with the education. But these are the kinds of things that I think are really important.
Yeah, I love the point about the 10-year-old. I want to come back to that. But Will, what would you like to add?
Yeah. I mean, I think Charles Christie as well. Like we've all read a couple of Robert's books in the past. He's been on the show a couple of times. I mean, this one I've looked through it. There's definitely some core themes there. I mean, so just in terms of the notes I took, like first of all, like single motherhood, as it's often described, I think fatherlessness is a better term, is an epidemic well beyond the Black community in ways that I don't think a lot of people know. Like I actually have the latest numbers on fatherlessness, and they're just nationally devastating. I mean, we're still the worst place group. We're 69%, but Native Americans are 65.7%. Single mom households, at least at birth, Puerto Ricans, 63.9. Mexicans, the largest Hispanic group, 52. Whites hit either 38% or 35.8%. That's non-Hispanic whites, if I recall correctly. So, I mean, we're at that point right now, that tipping point where like half the kids in the country don't have a dad on the birth certificate at birth. I mean, that's something. This is something I've seen as a Black problem, or in the South as a poor white problem. I mean, it's an incredibly sweeping national problem. So, I mean, focusing on that, either overall or in the context of the Black family, I think is obviously worth doing. And it's one of those weird things you're kind of not supposed to talk about in upper middle class discourse. Like, clearly, everything else aside, one of the great advantages of having a two-parent family, this is true for gay families for that matter, is that you have two incomes. So if you're a woman who has a welfare or 80% full-time job income of 28,000, and you marry just the most basic guy imaginable, like he's doing indoor sales for $39,000 a year, your income jumps up to 67,000. I mean, that's 3K below the national. There are a whole range of things in terms of schools, homes that you're going to be able to afford that would not be possible in the first situation. I mean, that's just obvious. I don't understand why that's at all debated. I mean, I guess one question, like I tend to talk a bit in the questions asked. One question I have for Robert is like, so when you mention some of these programs that are obviously practical, like incentives that would promote marriage or at least stable fathering, or like you talk a lot about these short-term certificates, which are, I mean, when you say stackable, you can combine a number of them. You can have different skills to bring to the table. How do you get people in cities like your New York or my Chicago to actually do that? That's my question.
Well, I think one of the problems is if you're a politician, you don't get any kudos for getting people into entry-level certificate programs.
Or
You
if I
get
can
them
jump
into
in for one sentence, or doing any other basic thing like paving the goddamn roads, which is a big problem in every big city. Sorry.
well, but you don't
College.
get
They
any.
just want college.
They just want. They don't even want like the medical associations. They don't even care if you graduate from medical school. You get through. They want you in. It's amazing how this notion, and they say, that there's still a very strong 4-year college premium over, you know, they just don't want to. And one of the things I have in my book is there's this organization, Third Way, which is more moderate arm of the Democratic Party, they and Brookings have been very aggressive in not allowing any changes in Pell Grants so that Pell Grants can be given for certificate programs.
Mhm.
They say openly it will discourage people from getting 4-year degrees.
As if they're getting them anyway.
I understand, but that's what they
Right.
say.
Because
There
they're
actually
going to
is a
college,
politi-
but they're not graduating.
As a political scientist, this actually is a big problem in urban planning in general. I think all three of you guys are familiar with this, but it's kind of like I'd say the perfect is the enemy of the good. And you see this constantly when you're trying to make any policy decision in a city, even a mid-sized city like Louisville. Like, what do you do about homelessness? One option is what are called SRO, single room occupancies. You set up some reasonably stable building, you clean it up, you give people 2 or 3 rooms to live in. You can't do that in most cities because these building codes that have been designed over the years by the left and the right fighting each other. So just like getting people out of their tents into a building and getting like some kind of sobriety training, nobody really wants that. What's proposed is these sort of like Bob actually mentioned like housing now. It's these dramatic programs that sound very impressive that are often tied in with either the political left or religion. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But the basic idea of why don't you just take the guy and put him in a cheap apartment building? There's really no advocacy for that. And like I'll advocate for that when I'm like a local leadership role, but you get an incredible amount of criticism because the idea is that living in an SRO, in my example, would be imperfect. It's not how Americans should be living, but neither is living in a box on the street. So the actual question is like, what are you doing? Good is bringing things from point A to a better point B. Are you doing that with your policies?
Well, and it's also this whole fear of incrementalism that somehow, if you have incremental policies, it will, in a certain way, reinforce inequality or white supremacy. But that incrementalism is dangerous uh, because, after all, it puts a lot of the onus on the individual. So you get your first certificate. What happens if you don't get your second one? What happens if you don't do this or that? You're not somehow going to get ahead. And meanwhile, it then says, well, you're at fault. You're the one that didn't succeed in this. So, I mean, I understand that there is a reluctance, particularly given the history of the Black community, there's a reluctance to look at this incrementalism and not see it as just one more pushing off uh, equity.
Right.
But they're wrong because they have no solution for what's going on in urban and Black communities
Right.
now.
Christy, one thing I want to get your thoughts on is the book, like as Robert pointed out when he did the summary, is how he tried to focus on a certain aspect, not just Black America, but a certain aspect, those on the lower rung. And isn't part of the problem, to his point, that we don't, I often say this all the time, we never really have the true conversations we need to have. So when we talk about this, he made alluded to the first. We always talk about the first person to run this, the first person in the CEO position, all this kind of stuff. So no one really seems to be focused on those that he's talking about, right? When you talk about policy, if you're talking about politicians running, say, what are you going to do? Even when people talk about the Black community from within the Black community, they're never really talking about the poorest among them, right? They're talking about union jobs or middle class or how many people are going to Harvard. You know, this affirmative action thing that happened. That wasn't about there are not enough Blacks going to college. The Blacks attend college at the same rate as whites. It's the number of Blacks in elite colleges. But that's not anything that's going to help. If Harvard doubled their admission tomorrow, it wouldn't help the average Black, right? Because the people that Robert's trying to help aren't going to Harvard. So do you see that? Do you think that that's a problem, that even when we talk about the problems, we're not talking about the people who are suffering the most from the problems?
Well, they've definitely, yeah, they've definitely have been forgotten about. I think part of the problem is that when you try to have the conversation, I mean, if I hadn't been told, I wouldn't know that Mr. Cherry was a liberal. I mean, he's probably been voted out of the party by now because this is not something that liberals,
He's definitely not a 2023 liberal, right?
they don't talk about personal responsibility and, making small changes. That just doesn't happen. But on the same hand, the second you say, as a Black person, personal responsibility, or you say, anything, it's, oh, but white supremacy, right? Or, oh, but, and we get with the excuses. So there is no room for these conversations for most people that are politicians. So they just stay away from it. And a part of the reason they stay away from it is because this demographics tends to be low voters. So there is no benefit for them to dive into this arena and to have these conversations, because they're either going to be called racist if they talk about the problems and the issues in a frank way. And then they're not looking at, votes. So it's not advantageous for them. But Mr. Cherry, I was going to tell you, in Arizona, I'm super proud of what the schools out here in my neighborhood are doing, because what they're starting to do, because we're school choice, we're really leading the wave in school choice. So starting from high school, they're starting to get kids onto a track to where they have certificates leaving high school. And so I think that is kind of like the next wave of what you're talking about. So a lot of times, they'll go through their freshman, junior year, or freshman, sophomore year. And then by junior year, they're either in apprenticeships with companies, they're getting certificates. So when they graduate, they'll have 2 years of work experience. So I think that might be.
That's being done for a while in South Carolina, in Louisiana. There are a number of states where this kind of strategy has been successful, but it's not in the urban north. In other words, the real distinction is, I think the 4-year college for all never was had such a strong adherence in many of these southern states. Southern states, I think, were much more accustomed to a more occupational, vocational vision for people. That so I think you see that with community colleges. In urban areas, the community colleges have only been feeders for the 4-year colleges. Whereas in rural areas and elsewhere, for a long time, many of them have had strong vocational programs linked to corporations. Like John Deere would run things in rural Illinois. So I think you really have this kind of split where these more liberal coastal states, the community colleges, particularly in the urban areas there, have just been 4-year college for all.
I want to talk about one of the biggest obstacles to the solutions in your book, and you write about it not as an obstacle, but I personally see it as an obstacle. But you talk about, in several different categories, from crime to housing to everything, about how a lot of these liberal policies are hurting people, and a lot of it comes from the way they want to fix the problem. Like, Will makes fun of me sometimes for giving people their arguments, so I assume positive intent, and it's like, I don't really think, but in some cases I'm kind of kidding, Will, but seriously, I don't really think that there's like a lot of people on the right says that's a sinister spot on the left. Everybody's a socialist and they're trying to bring down the country. Some of them are. Some of them are just dumb, or some of them think they're helping, right? And so we got a lot of these elites that, right, well, we need to help. So we think that there's a disparity because we've listened to Kendi, and all gaps means racist. So we're just trying to fix racism. And so recently I sent Christy and Will a clip from the board meeting. Robert, you were asking me if I won that position. I was told you it was going to come up. So we had a recent thing. So after COVID, they use it as an excuse, saying COVID, but really, on de Blasio's way out, he decided to change the enrollment Yeah, everybody knew nationally what he did with the high schools, but also changed the enrollment to the selective enrollment middle schools in New York. So think of, for those of you not in New York, think of it for the gifted school kids, the kids that are better at math and science, the people who are a year ahead in their class, to give them, to push them further, so when they get into high school, they can be on track to take calculus earlier and different sciences and things of that nature. And those used to be, you used to have to test to get in. So they got rid of the test and replaced it with the lottery, but they openly said they did it to desegregate these schools and to integrate them, because there weren't enough Black kids at these schools. And I say Black, they didn't say Black, but we know what they mean, because there weren't mostly white kids at these schools. They were mostly Asian. Right. So that's what they wanted to do. Just so you know, they wanted to put Black kids in school, and they're basically openly saying the Blacks can't pass the test. So they did it for 2 years. And so now I'm on the board, and we're trying to vote whether Banks comes in, kudos to Eric Adams, and he brings in somebody a little more moderate who was running it before, who is now the Secretary of Education, right? He moved on there. So now you got a new person in New York. And he made it a district-wide choice. So we can do different things in the different districts. And again, New York is big, so we're just on a district. I'm on a district board just for our district. So we're like, okay, we want our district to go back to testing. And then at the meeting, they're like, this is racist, this is that kind of stuff. And I'm like, and so my argument, and I'm gonna read a piece from Robert's book, which is beautiful because it speaks to what my argument was. I said, you're trying to get 20 or 30 Black kids in this school so you can pat yourself on the back and feel good, say, look what I did. But what you can do is keep the test. Currently the Black kids, many of them wouldn't pass, but then fix the schools that the Black kids are in so they're able to pass the test to get in. Right, improve that. If there's a opportunity gap or something, that you run the schools, you're the DO, you can fix that. But that would do a far better job and go a lot further, helping more kids if that school was better. Because one, more kids would actually get in that school by testing, right? But even the ones who don't test to get in would be better because they have a better school environment. And your book says you're talking about them trying to, desegregate or really integrate, put more Black people in different areas and different schools. And you said at the time, wish they'd still do this, because you're talking about New York City. New York City took a similar approach to increase the number of Black and Latino students enrolled in the 3 elite public high schools. To increase the numbers, the city's Department of Education began an enrichment program, the Math Science Institute, available to students from the 20 underrepresented school districts, which were overwhelmingly Black or Latino. Students who were accepted participated in a program that began the summer following the 6th grade. The students attended daily from the beginning of July to the second week in August, and twice each week during the 7th grade. Then they spent a second summer in the program and attended a test preparation course in the autumn of their 8th grade year. In the first year, 419 students enrolled, 310 completed successfully, and almost 3/4 of them were either Black or Latino, and they had a 50% passing rate on the entrance exam to the 3 specialized schools. So that was a way that would increase the numbers like they want, but in the right way. So I don't think you put what year this was, but now I'm living here in this same city, and they're saying doing that thing is racist. And what you need to do is lower the standards and let them in.
What I didn't know at the time, this was about 20 years ago. They then expanded it for a year or two, and then they got rid of it. And I had no idea why. Why they got rid of it was that the Private School Association of New York began exactly that program.
They took the kids.
They took the kids. So one of the reasons only 7 Black students got into Stuyvesant this year, it's not that there aren't smart Black kids.
Right.
They've all been siphoned off into the private schools.
Yeah.
People don't talk about it. And it's good for those kids. Yeah. It's good for those kids.
Yeah.
But it gives a very distorted view of what's going on, including in the competitiveness for the middle schools, because the private schools, they take those kids. So
that is a perfect point. I'm glad you make that point, because they act like there's racism in the system, but the private schools are clamoring for more Black kids too. So they're like, oh, we can get the Black kids. They take those kids, and then we fake force some into the other selected kids, and then all the kids who are stuck in the other school, there's no reason to make their school better because we got the numbers we wanted.
That's actually really fascinating just from a strategic perspective. So you guys are saying that the reason there are only 7 black kids in style. So first of all, like Tom Sowell in one of his books talks about like the New York, the best academic public schools. They used to be about 12% black. So I mean, I'm sure New York's 20% black. We're a little underrepresented. You can get into reasons for that. But there used to be a ton of black kids that went there. Like this wasn't disputed. And I've always thought that the reason that changed was basically just lowering test scores and so on. But you're saying like there's so much demand for black kids versus Asian or white kids that Latin school or whatever your equivalent is will just come and ask them.
Private schools. Yep.
Yeah, they'll just ask them to go to that. That's amazing. So how many do you know how many good public school qualified black kids there are in private school? Like 600 or something?
There are certainly a number like that or greater.
Wow.
Keep in mind, the schools aren't just in New York. Some of these people go to boarding schools and go to Connecticut somewhere and just stay there. So it's not even just it's a lot of schools.
No, and they are the students who are the feeders to the Ivy League. Yeah. I forget the name of the fellow who had a book on it.
Who was it?
But a majority of the kids in the Ivy League schools, black kids, went to private schools.
Right. Yep.
I think I have that book. Actually, it's The Privileged Poor by Skip.
Yes.
Jackman.
Yeah, that's it. Yep.
Yes.
And Will, you and I have a we won't say the name, but we have a mutual personal friend who has a kid in an affluent school, and I didn't realize it, but she said, yeah, there are other kids that are there during the week, and they're bored, and then they go home on the weekends.
Yeah, but
let's get back.
It's just very briefly, like it's an amazing counter to the constant claims of racism, because obviously there is racism. Like I live in a mostly working class community. If you're a young black man, you go to family court, you might experience something. But like in every like lower upper class setting I've ever encountered, like applying to a good college, there's an enormous advantage that goes along with being a member of one of the underrepresented minority groups. So I mean, this whole thing that like there are prep schools that are taking the smartest black kids out of New York to Connecticut boarding schools to like raise them is hilarious. And I mean, I never knew that. But a secondary element of that, though, is kind of who those kids are. Like Jack in his book, Last Thing, but he looks at, and Henry Louis Gates did this decades ago, but he looks at the composition of the kids that go to what he calls esteemed university. And it's like of the black kids on campus, 3/4 of them are either biracial, they're lords from foreign countries like Ghana, or they are just rich. Like you're the son of like one of the people mentioned at one of the lowest ranking schools in the book was like Master P's son. So I mean, there's one, there are the kids that are being taken out and brought into these preps, and two, there's the question of who these kids are. Like
whoa. But let's get back to the lower tier. That no, and I mean, what has always struck me as there's such an unwillingness to talk about why these low scores for black 10-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
And, these fourth grade scores are a real predictor because you don't have a magic pill. And you can't, somehow they'll have these great teachers in middle school and they'll be turned around and so on. Mm-hmm. That, these first K through 4 and 5 are really the fundamentals. And nobody's talking about that, about what you can do to rectify that.
Well, can I say something about that too? Because I know Christy and Will both made a point of this, and I know now I'm going to get in trouble. I try not to, but you point out how, people try to, Christy, I think you were talking about how people try to parse the numbers between single family mothers and fatherlessness. With some of them, that's not disrespectful because it's not really fatherlessness, because just because they're not married, he may be in home, or he may be an active father and they're not together. So if he's in the home, that's different. But the active father, but they're not together piece, I mean, kudos to him. He could be doing a lot, but you got to understand that those years are vital. We talk about the gap when you start kindergarten that you can look at just by the number of books in the home. Well, if there's no one there reading to that kid, teaching them to read, having them sound out word and have them read every day. Well, if he's not in the home, he's not doing that every day. He's seeing the kid 2 or 3 times a week. How is he reading to him every day? Maybe reading to him when he sees them, but that you need that every day. Like my son reads for an hour every night, right? 30 minutes to an hour every night, right? And he's reading books. Then people are like, how's he reading that book? Because he's been reading since he was 3 all the time. I didn't start in the school. I don't wait for the school to give him a book. Now, once you get to school, you're reading books. And Robert's point is there's no magic bullet because you can't get you don't need money. You don't need at that point, you don't need a father, you don't need a mother, you know what you need? Time. And you can't get time back. So if I'm already behind, every year there's more expectation, there's more growth, there's more knowledge you need to get, and you're already behind. So I think that's part of that problem there. And I think that's a piece that a lot of people might be missing. It's not a knock on the people, but you keep 10 years old. You mentioned 10 years old earlier. I said I was going to come back to that. That's why that's so important, because if you let them get behind at 10, they're behind at 15 and 20, and it's very little you can do. It's not impossible, but they would have to have some kind of unbelievable will within them that they're going to get.
That's why a lot of these youth have to go into certificate programs because they don't catch up.
Right. And then we're trying to get them into 4-year colleges.
Yeah.
But you talk about another thing too, housing.
But let me just say something about mothers in this situation. I think the vast majority of mothers want to do right about their kids.
Of course.
But they often don't know what to do. They often have tremendous stresses on their time and they fall behind. I talk about in the book and some of the articles I've written that just as for people to stay on key with their exercise routine, they need a coach. They need somebody to prod them, to give them advice about how to do this or that. And particularly for many of these young women who are having their first kid, they don't necessarily have the best role models that have prepared them for what they should be doing. And so that's why these visiting nursing programs can play a tremendously positive role in not only keeping them on track of what they should be doing, but also counseling them on their own personal lives. Because, the world's complicated for unmarried women.
Right.
And, they're going to make a lot of choices. And if you have someone in your corner, you got a much better chance of making the best decisions you can in those situations.
Right.
So I really think that we can help these mothers be the kind of mothers they want to be, but we have to have strategies for doing that. And I think the charter schools are very good at that. They keep the mothers involved, whether it's keeping a diary of what their kid has done. There are constructive strategies to keep mothers on track, and particularly when they have tremendous time constraints and often lack of knowledge, these things can be pretty critical.
Mr. Terry, how do the programs are there. They already exist, everything that you're talking about. The problem is the people that you're talking about in the inner city are not accessing them. So how do we make them popular? How do we make them something that these young mothers or these inner city mothers will take advantage of?
Well, we don't have that much visiting nursing programs. I remember, they're half-assed. One city has a little demonstration project here or there. There's no, when a young woman comes in, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, when she comes in and finds out she's pregnant, she's not saying, she's not immediately offered these services of a visiting nurse, and she's not saying, I don't need that person, I don't need this or that. They're not even, they're not extensively offered. They're somewhat expensive, right? You have, and it's just not a priority. I can't tell you why. De Blasio, before he left office in New York, was going to uh, pretty extensively increase visiting nursing programs. I don't know what's happened. It's just not something that is in the budgets.
Mm,
Uh, it's not being turned down. People, who's going to turn that down?
right.
You know, it, and it's just been positive experience. I mean, I have in my book a number of discussions of these women and how they are just they feel so blessed with having this service, and we should just do more of it.
Right. Right. Um, two other things that you talk about that kind of go against the narrative. You talk about the way to combat violence, and you talk about housing. And with housing, I don't know if they're gonna like that, but you make the case that gentrification isn't a bad thing.
Yes, and I point out that Warren Buffett is head of a program uh, to identify uh, neighborhoods, low income neighborhoods, often ones with housing projects,
Mhm,
and how to turn those neighborhoods around by building more housing
mhm,
for middle class and link it up with schools and other infrastructure.
mhm.
Uh, we have to turn around these neighborhoods. Now, part of it is you have to get the crime under control.
Right.
You don't get the crime under control, you're not going to get middle class people moving into these neighborhoods. You could say we got this charter school, we got this, unless they feel safe in those neighborhoods. So there's a link between stopping or getting under control crime in neighborhoods and then building the housing and infrastructure
Right.
that redevelops those neighborhoods.
And how do you combat the crime with no police? Because we want to defund the police.
You have these violence disruptors. You're going to do
Right.
it all, right?
Right, right.
No, I talk in my book, and in fact, one of the things is I looked at the spike in homicides in 21, and there were like three cities that stood out that didn't have that spike. They were Newark, St. Paul, Minnesota, and St. Petersburg in Florida. And each of those had a twin city. So St. Paul has Minneapolis, St. Petersburg has Tampa, and Newark had New York. And it was striking the difference. So I actually was able to get contacts to talk to people, community organizations, uh, and people in city government about what went on in those three cities, why those three cities, Newark, St. Paul, and St. Petersburg, why they didn't have the spike. And they told the same story. And that is you had a coordination between city hall, police, and communities. And what that coordination involved was having liaisons to the police, to the black churches in those communities, and hiring from the community in the police department. Now, these are small communities. So when you're hiring from the community, you really are. Like in New York City, if you say they have to live in New York City, they can live in all kinds of places that are pretty distant
Right.
from uh, the real crime issues.
Mhm.
But in these three more middle-sized cities of 300,000, they all had about 300,000 people. If you're hiring from the city, you're hiring people from the neighborhoods. And so I, I published something on this in National Affairs. I have some in my book that there are ways if you get coordination with community organizations, uh, black churches in particular, but there are other organizations. And if you get a police department that is constructive and most of them want to be, I mean, they don't want these problems
Right.
with community. How are you going to solve crime if you can't work with people in the community?
Right.
So, I don't know what can work in big cities,
Mm.
but at least in these more middle-sized cities, which would include St. Louis, there are a lot of Tucson, there are a lot of cities of this 500,000 figure. Uh, and so uh, I'm hopeful. And there's Thomas Abt has this criminologist, Thomas Abt. He's this focused deterrence where he has some of the same things that I'm describing.
Mhm.
Uh, so that there are people out there and cities that understand what they need. And so I think there's a strategy. And
Right.
once you get the crime under control, you can begin to have housing development within those neighborhoods.
Right. To
There's a
bring
lot of vacant land in those neighborhoods.
right to bring in some mixed income, bring in some middle class people to
Yeah,
kind of to
yeah.
offset. Will, anything you want to add?
Well, I mean, I personally think gentrification is clearly good. Like, I mean, the conversation between you guys was a bit wide ranging, but I mean, there's actually a meme on the internet that mostly comes from the hard right, but it's pretty good. And it's just like the bottom of the meme is the word racism. And like every arrow in the meme points to racism. So it's like white guy leaves a diverse, heavily black, thriving neighborhood, white flight. White guy moves into a diverse, heavily black, thriving neighborhood, gentrification. So on down the
Right.
line. And it's like, white guy doesn't go to a black school, you know, bus, whatever. We need busing. White
Right.
guy does go to a black school and starts his quarterback, fetishization. And there are
Right.
like 10 or 12 more across the bottom. And if you've ever talked to an urban liberal, like you recognize it immediately.
Mhm.
Yes.
Present company, of course, accepted. But I mean, so the basic idea that it's generally a good thing for neighborhoods, like you might want to help long-term residents with their property taxes or something. And again, something we're all talking about here is real solutions. Okay, there's an issue with 8 people being forced out of their homes. Can we help them? What's the bill for that going to be? I
Right.
mean, but while you discuss that kind of thing, I mean, just the idea of a more diverse, better paid group of people moving into an area is good. That's
Right.
it. I don't really have a
One,
ton more to say about that. Just
one of the things I had in my book is there's this Kelsey housing project in New York. It had lots of vacant land,
they all do,
which
yeah.
wasn't being used. So it was proposed we'll build housing on that land and move people. There were two low-rise buildings in this project. We'll move the people from those two low-rise buildings into the new building, and we will build mixed housing we'll tear down those other two buildings and build mixed housing there.
Mhm.
Liberals refused to allow that. It was never done.
Hmm.
That was like a win-win strategy. It wasn't you're worrying about moving people out or whatever. You say, here, we're moving them into the new housing, and then we'll build on this vacant. They just are irrational.
I mean, every
So
time they hurt, ouch.
so I guess I'm the lone person that is not in favor of gentrification. And it's more, I haven't
Keep
studied.
Whitey out.
I it's more
But
because,
most of that gentrification is going to be middle-class blacks. It's not going to be
well,
whites in these neighborhoods.
She didn't want them either.
well, I'm I consider myself from LA because I lived there the majority of my life. So I can tell you from what I've seen versus I haven't studied the issue, but from what I've seen,
Mhm.
Inglewood, Leimert Park, Ladera, all extremely strong Black neighborhoods, or they were.
Mhm.
Gentrification has decimated, especially Inglewood now with the stadium being there. People can't afford to live in California anyways. Now in California, there is not room to grow. There's
Right,
not
right.
room
You
to
can't build.
build. And even the poor areas, people are living in homes. in these neighborhoods. They're not living in, projects, or for the most part. So you take Inglewood, you plop the stadium there, you're pricing people out of their homes.
Yeah,
So
but where did the people go?
Yeah, but see, I'm talking about
Did the people? But wait a minute, Robert. Did the people own their homes?
Yes, the people own their
they're
homes.
wealthy now.
No, they can't afford the taxes.
But they sold a house and they made money.
Yes,
but people don't want to sell their homes. People want, especially if you're talking about Leimert Park, where it's like a historical Black neighborhood.
But if they sold it, they get a bunch of money, right?
Again,
I just asked a question, Christy. I can't.
Wait.
Right, but I'm saying, so they bought the house for 50 grand. It's worth $1 million.
Well, I'm talking about a different kind of gentrification, which is building new housing. You're talking about neighborhoods that didn't have building. You just had a transfer of residents.
Right. Because the value.
That's a trickier situation.
okay.
But if you have neighborhoods where you have vacant land where you can build housing, then we're talking about a much different situation. Right. And that's the kind of gentrification that Warren Buffett has financed around the country.
Well, I'm from Gary, Indiana. We need some gentrification. We got more. We got more than empty land. We got burnt up houses. Will you take those?
I think there's an important difference here. So like what Christy's talking about are neighborhoods that were like middle class, maybe working class, like long-term Black neighborhoods. And you get into this, like buddies of mine from California will talk about, like, is Compton a Black or Hispanic city? Like you'll get into people wanting to keep their area the way it is. Now, even that, technically forbidden by civil rights law and all that. But I think that's a different question.
That's about civil rights.
But I mean, like you don't see a lot of South Boston Irishmen welcoming in Italians and Blacks and so on with open arms. Like that's something that people do. I think that in terms of like the Midwest slum areas, though, like Charles, when you say you're from Gary, I mean, like when I go back to the east side of Aurora or the south side of Chicago, I mean, you see a lot of buildings that don't have windows in them. I mean, there's a lot of just unoccupied land. And I mean, I think when one of the things that always surprised me, because I grew up in a tough working class neighborhood, and there were people everywhere, like dogs running around, people grilling on the street, this kind of thing. But when I went to the hyper ghetto
with the grill, or is the meat actually on the street?
No. I mean, you take your grill, you take the top off your grill, you sit outside, you drink 12 beers with a bunch of other, Slavic or Hispanic cats. It's a great feeling of neighborhood, actually. But the point, though, is like years later when I went to actual hyper ghetto to Chicago to like play at a basketball tournament or watch my friends buy weed, or just like later as a graduate student, what struck me was the lack of population density. Like in the blocks across from the housing projects, the Jets, you'd see like one functional house with a perfectly normal family living in it, and then like 2 empty buildings, and then a building full of junkies, and then like one house, and then a building where they bred pit bull puppies, and then 2 empty buildings, and then a building full of junkies. And I think like just sending normal taxpayers into those areas with any sort of vouchers, whatever the conservative system might be, you just buy a house for $1 if you fix it, that would obviously improve those neighborhoods. I mean, like, just for the laymen in the audience who aren't from one of the big cities, just watch The Wire about just a mid-sized city. It's like there are a lot of neighborhoods that look just like that. Like you have one occupied row house where grandma lives, and then a block.
They're called Cleveland and Detroit.
Right.
Yeah, there's a song about Cleveland where the chorus is "At least we're not Detroit," by like a working class white like indie rock band, but the song is actually hilarious. Like one line is "Come look at both of our buildings," but they talk about that in the Black.
Let's stop beating up the middle
white sections of Cleveland, East Side Cleveland, where MGK is from. You just walk around, there's nobody. That's the point. Like it's a bunch of abandoned ass buildings and then like a food truck. And I think that putting people in that area would be a good thing.
Okay, I'm glad we cleared that up. Now I'm with you guys.
Now I gotta ask the question, Robert, because I thought Christy would ask it or will, and I didn't want to be the guy nobody will ask. So what's with the white guy writing the book about the state of the Black family?
Well,
you guys weren't doing it.
I'm serious.
What can I tell you? I grew up, I was in college in the 60s, was very left-wing. Race was a key issue. And so when I got into academia, that's what I focused on. My I don't have any apology for it. Uh, that's what I've spent 50 years researching, and for a good number of those years, I was an activist in fighting, not in necessarily the best way, but fighting for a better society, for less racism. Uh, so, that's just my political origins coming out of the 60s, and I've stuck with it.
Okay. Now, what this
I
one's
talk about that actually in the book, in
yep,
the introductory chapter.
yep. And this one's for Christy, because earlier Christy was like, you talked about personal responsibility and those kind of things. And she said, you don't sound like a liberal. This is something I always give you all a hard time. So I got to give, Robert and I talk all the time, so I can give him a hard time. All the liberals do, especially since 21 or 20, and I give them a hard time. So you were wondering if Robert was a liberal. He's talking about the white liberals calling everybody, like, everything can't be racist. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. And he says, one truism that I believe to be unfounded is the widely held liberal belief that white Americans, particularly those with less than a 4-year college degree, voted for Trump to maintain white supremacy. Good for Robert. He goes on, though. While Trump is clearly racist himself, I'm gonna get through this. It has been implicitly and explicitly endorsed by many overt racists. This view overlooks that, and he goes on to say why that may not be true. So now you believe he's a liberal, because that is a liberal tagline to say for the.
Well, what I point out in the book is that it's beyond that many of them had voted for Obama,
Right.
but that if you look at black candidates for the Senate,
Yep.
James in Michigan,
Tim Scott.
Scott in South Carolina,
Mhm.
you look at Youngkin and his election, he had
DeSantis
a
wouldn't be
black
governor.
lieutenant governor, a Caribbean woman
Right.
who ran independently.
Mhm.
You look at all of those elections,
Mhm.
the Republican vote for the black candidate was, well, in the two Senate elections, were the same as for the Republican candidate for president.
Mhm.
So that the same people who voted for Trump in 2016, the same people voted for James in Michigan and voted for Scott in South Carolina.
Right.
So, they
Hmm.
it's hard to see them as hardcore racists. They
No,
certainly have
your point was valid. I just mentioned that only a liberal would add the line. While Trump is clearly racist himself, it has been implicitly and explicitly endorsed by many overt racists. That's the point I'm talking about.
I gotta make clear that Trump is a pig. Don't we all have to do that to be legitimate?
That's actually a really funny and honest line. Like, hey, look, I want half my readers to be liberal. Yeah. Throw a couple bricks at Trump at the start. He's not
That
president
was so
anymore.
awesome. That's so awesome. So, anything you want to leave the people with to make them want to read the book, because it's a really important issue.
Well, I think if you want to see the evidence behind some of these bullet points that have been mentioned tonight,
Mhm.
they're there, and there are, I think, other kinds of uh, policies. This whole issue of absent fathers, that there are certain fatherhood programs that can be at the margin effective.
Yep.
In so anyway, I think there's more in the book uh, than, but it does fill in a number of the bullet points that have been spoken about tonight,
Right.
and I think it's well written. And I have
I appreciate
grandchildren.
the shout out, by the way. Thanks a lot.
Okay, well, look, Thanks for having me,
No.
and I'm sure we'll cross paths personally.
Yeah, we'll have to. Yeah, and we'll talk when your next book come out. He is Robert Cherry, author of The State of the Black Family. Robert, thanks for joining us.
And thanks for having me, and take care.
I got a country to say, God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.